once people realize that they want the same thing, but they're approaching it from different ways, I think it really opens up the conversation to say, okay, so we actually aren't so different. How do we move closer in how we execute on these goals?
Welcome to LoveLink, your guide to relationships in all forms. We're your hosts, Simone Humphrey and Sina Simon. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Sarah Bren, a psychologist and parenting expert, about how to help parents get on the same page. So welcome, Sarah. So great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
So we see a lot of couples in our practice. And for those couples who are parents, one of the concerns that comes up a lot is getting on the same page around parenting and kind of how to navigate different parenting styles. So, an example can be like one parent that's maybe more strict than the other. Recently, I had a case where it was starting early. It was around sleep training, where the male partner wanted to do a very strict sleep training, and the mother was having a really hard time with that and wanted to sit in the bedroom until the baby fell asleep. So already there was a discrepancy, like kind of an uncoordinated parenting from the start. So I'm curious about what you see in terms of parents who aren't on the same page. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I work with a lot of parents doing like kind of parenting support and family therapy. And so obviously I have a self-selecting population coming to me to start with, but like typically when I'm working with families, it's really, really common for there to be some degree of discrepancy in parenting styles or approaches. Obviously, if it's very, very different, like we're fundamentally at odds with how we think about what our goals are and how you execute those goals, we're going to have more and more friction, like the more far apart two parents come through. But I have seen parents who have really, truly different, fundamentally different positions on parenthood and parenting their child come together to really have a cohesive parenting approach. I think there's ways where that could be more successful. There has to be some degree of like openness and flexibility. But I also think a big myth is that parents have to be exactly in sync with each other for there to be successful outcomes. Like you can genuinely, I've seen so many times where like just getting parents to move like 10 degrees closer to one another has massive impacts, and they don't have the same exact parenting style, and their kids do great with it. So like a lot of the answers to questions, it depends, and it's both and.
Yeah, you could imagine in an ideal world having complementary parenting styles. They can play into their different strengths and actually really kind of give more of like a full, robust parenting to a kid. And that could have its benefits too. I'm curious though what you've noticed are the impact on a kid with parents who have very different parenting styles and what that's like. And I know that's a general question and I'm sure looks very different, but yeah, what have been your
Yeah.
observations?
Well, I think the more specific way I could answer that is like when a child has parents who have very differing parenting styles, and there is a lot of conflict around those parenting styles in action, right? So, one parent is undermining the other parent in real time when they're showing up in a particular way, like, or there's a lot of fighting outside of the heat of the moment, around who's doing it right, who's doing it wrong. Parents are feeling judged, they're feeling defensive. That's when I would say it's going to have the potential to really, really be overwhelming for a kid and can really derail a lot of the potential progress that these parents who are clearly putting time and energy into parenting are hopefully trying to get to, right? They usually, when parents have differing approaches, they still have an approach, right? They care. There's something important to them that they're trying to uphold in their parenting. And so that can be undermined or derailed if there's a lot of conflict between the parents on what's right, what's not right. I think the ideal scenario in those situations is to understand that the conflict there is the problem, not the differing parenting styles per se. So that's usually where I start with families, is trying to help them understand, what's your why? Why is this particular type of parenting important to you? What are you trying to achieve with it? What are your fears? Like, what is the thing you're trying to protect against in raising your child? What are you afraid is going to happen if you don't do it this way? And usually, when both parents have space to talk about what they want and what they're afraid of, we can usually find where we're in alignment, and then we kind of work backwards from there.
Mm.
It seems really important what you're saying about highlighting that actually, in these cases, it seems like both parents really want to be highly involved in the decision making around their kids, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's where I like to work with parents too, is to like, where are the strengths in this parenting, like dyad? Or, I mean, we're assuming we're talking about two parents trying to parent together, but like this also comes up with like parent-in-laws and like grandparents. It comes up all the time, like when people who are cooks in the kitchen, if you will, have differing views on how to raise a kid. But when we're talking about couples who, feel that conflict because they're both so invested in their child and they want to help their kid, we're seeing typically one parent who's sort of overprotective and very worried about managing the relational component and the relational safety, and is really concerned with like making sure that this child is feeling, really safe and just contained, right? And the other parent tends to fall on that other end of that spectrum of like high demand. And usually it's coming also from a place of protecting that kid, right? This is how they're going to learn how the world works. This is how they understand what's expected of them. I want this child to succeed in life, and I don't want them to think they can't handle any of these things. So I want to, sort of push them to get it. So that tends to be like where I often see the splitting directions, right? And, both parents are holding up an important part of the house and they feel like, oh man, I'm doing this thing over here because this other parent isn't doing any of this. And the other parent's like, I'm doing this thing over here on the other side of the house because this parent isn't doing any of it. And neither parent thinks it's safe to move into the middle because they're afraid what they're holding up will crumble. And so that, I think, is a very powerful aha moment for both parents to see like, oh, for me or for the other to be able to move closer to what I want them to do in parenting, I have to be willing to do a little bit of what they're doing. Both parents have to hold both sides of the house.
It's almost like in the couples work we do, we work a lot with cycles. Sina and I both do a lot of emotionally focused couples work, and kind of thinking about the more one person does one action or behavior, the more another person does another action behavior. And so the more one person is taking charge and the less the other person is, the more that feeds into the fear of that initial parent. It also makes me think of the relational conflict between the two parents too, because I've seen a lot of parents where one has a very strong belief about the safety of their child, and the other has a differing strong belief about the safety of their child. But then one parent comes off as very critical, and the other parent feels like their parenting is being criticized, or they're not doing enough, or they're feeling like a failure. So instead of being flexible and negotiating, it's almost like they dig their heels in further. And so something that may have been like, well, we should take their temperature now versus later, becomes this big moment of like conflict because it feels like one parent is feeling inadequate and needs to prove themselves.
Yes, I see that so much. And that's why I think that when we frame it this way for a couple to say, well, what are your goals and what are your fears? Most of the time, they're the same. Like, I want my kid to be healthy. I want them to have good relationships. I want them to, do well in the world. I want them to feel safe. That's almost always everyone's goals. Once people realize that they want the same thing, but they're approaching it from different ways, I think it really opens up the conversation to say, okay, so we actually aren't so different. How do we move closer in how we execute on these goals? Or maybe tolerate that to some degree, we don't have the same standards on this. And that's okay. Just like kids can adapt to, a teacher who has different expectations of them than maybe a parent or a grandparent who treats things a little differently, has different rules in their home. Kids are pretty good at figuring out what their expectations are within a relationship and adapting to that.
What do you see happen when kids do feel unsafe? The environment is not predictable, the parenting is not predictable, and parents really are too discrepant.
It can be very, very aggravating. When I say aggravating, I mean it can aggravate the presenting issues. Like if a kid is coming to me, if parents are coming to me, more often than not, parents don't come to me because they want me to guide them on their parenting. They come to me because their kid is having behavioral issues or is erupting at school or is just out of control at home or there's something that's not working, right? And then we kind of work backwards and figure out how can the parents understand these sort of explosions that are happening from a larger sort of family systems lens to create some other outcomes, right? Like if a kid, usually it's not just because one parent is approaching parenting different than the other parent. Usually there's other stressors going on, but there can become these like dances that parents get entrenched in with their kid that can make things worse. And so looking at those situations and trying to figure out, like, okay, what's my goal in these moments? What am I trying to get my kid to be able to do? Is it to be able to self-regulate? Is it to be able to inhibit impulse? Is it to be able to cooperate or move through transitions more smoothly? Like whatever it is, usually parents may have a different approach to get their kid to do that thing. And that's where I think if we don't have developmentally appropriate expectations of a child, oftentimes that's a place where there's room for, like low-hanging fruit. Usually it's like, okay, sometimes we think this is just we have different parenting style, but really actually one parent just has their expectations of the child are not developmentally appropriate. And so in helping them kind of reframe what is and is not in reach for my child, that alone can really get a lot of the sort of what looks like discrepant parenting styles, help them get on the same page. Because sometimes it's not parenting styles, it's parenting expectations actually that are really discrepant.
And I imagine regulating parenting nervous systems. If they're having a kid that's really distressed and they're coming from a dysregulated place, they might parent in a more impulsive way or reactive way, and that might not actually be aligned with what their values are.
Yes, that's another huge thing that I think can contribute to what looks like parental differing styles is actually different skills of the parent to self-regulate. Like if you have one parent who is really able to stay regulated in higher stress, more frustrating, overwhelming situations, like say a kid losing their stuff, I don't mean like their things, but like losing their mind, being out of control. And we have a parent who has a higher threshold for that, who can stay calm, who can have access to their parenting toolbox because their prefrontal cortex has not also gone offline. Then that parent's going to look so much more skillful. And we might perceive that parent to have, quote, a better parenting style. But a parent who gets flooded very quickly, who gets triggered and is reactive when they are in threat and has a harder time coming back down to baseline, they might have really similar parenting goals as the other parent. So a big thing that I do with parents is also like parental self-regulation. Like, are you struggling not to pour gasoline on a fire when your kid is having a hard time? Because when you're calm, when you're regulated, you can really access your own toolbox so much more effectively.
So when you have one parent who's so overwhelmed that they can't respond to their child from a regulated place, what do you recommend to the other parent, the regulated parent, in supporting their partner or in asking their partner to step to the side?
Yeah, a tremendous amount of compassion, because usually such a common sequence of like everything falling apart, right? You have a kid who maybe is super sensitive, a little bit explosive, has a hard time like with impulse control or cooperating, or just does something that tends to really push the buttons of another parent, right? So then you have this kid who gets dysregulated easily. You have a parent who gets really reactive to that child in those moments. Then you usually have a parent who tends to be less reactive and can sit here and watch what's happening and say, hey, partner, why are you making this so much worse? Or here's what you're doing wrong. Or here, like, stop doing this. Or like, versus saying, whoa, you're in threat mode right now. You actually need my help, not to feel judged, but to feel supported. And also, I'm going to tap in. But you can't tap in when one parent's super hot unless you have previously discussed this in a calm, cool, connected
Mm-hmm.
moment and gotten on the same page and said, hey, this has been happening. I know it doesn't feel good. I know you really want this X, whatever, to happen differently. Like, I know you want our kid to do this more or not do this. But when you get frustrated, it kind of pours gasoline on the fire. I want to help you. Like, what would work for you? How do I tap in when you need to tap out? How do we have a way of supporting each other that way, without it feeling like a criticism in the moment? Like, there has to be this sort of like outside work on looking at these patterns where it's not going so well and figuring out a way for you guys to like lean on each other and actually receive someone else tapping in without it feeling like it's going to just activate your defenses even more.
That's so helpful. I feel like this is can be such a huge problem. Often parents are coming in where one parent is really judgmental of the other one and really critical. And it just, like you're saying, adds to the chaos, adds to the conflict. I
Yeah.
wonder what advice you would have for the person who gets triggered.
Yeah. The thing is if you have two people who have different parenting styles and they're like getting frustrated with each other and there's conflict around that, or they're feeling like that is a source of conflict in their relationship, then everything is so much more loaded and you're so much more likely to have one or the both of you lose it more often. I also think that like there is not a parent, regardless of whether or not we feel like we're in complete alignment with our partner and our parenting styles. There's not a parent in the world who doesn't get triggered by their kids and has to figure out, how do I depersonalize this and how do I calm my own self down so that I can actually meet my kid where they're at and help them move through this. And then in the other end of this, whenever that's over, when we've made it through, we've ridden the wave of the big, explosive, emotional blah, and we're at the other side of it, and that child is feeling back in safety and connection with us. Then we can teach, then we can discipline, then we can give them, reset the expectations. But like, to answer your question in a roundabout way, I'm saying like this is a good question for any parent to ask, regardless of whether or not you're on the same page with your parenting partner, because you're always going to get triggered by your kid eventually. And so I think what I tend to tell parents is to really look at patterns. Are there certain times of day? Are there certain types of transitions? Are there certain behaviors that your kid engages in that always seem to get you overwhelmed? So like, for example, I am horrible at time management. And so mornings in my house are always super chaotic and rushed, no matter how much I try to prep ahead. So I know that mornings or any time where I'm feeling a sense of urgency or I'm rushing are times where I am 10 times more vulnerable to losing it with my kids. So knowing that irrespective of my children's behavior in the moment, when I feel rushed or a sense of urgency, I am more likely to get dysregulated. An example of it being like a behavior is like if every time your kid hits their sibling, you are flooded with this sort of like mama bear instinct to protect your second child, you might notice that like you are far less patient and able to stay regulated and able to kind of be this sort of safety keeper because you're just flooded. Like your mama bear instinct got activated and now you're not really in a regulated state, you're in a like hyper threat state. Or if it's back talk, I have a lot of people I work with who are like, when their kids talk back to them, they see red. And we have to unpack like, what is it about them giving you that back talk that is activating for you? And a lot of times it's because, if I talked like that to one of my parents, I would have been just in so much trouble. And I would have been, severely punished or shamed or reprimanded. And so I'm actually, there's a part of me in this moment that's like kind of like an inner child that's like, don't do that. That's not safe. We can't do that. We're going to get in big trouble for like, don't do that. Just looking at these things, looking at these patterns, identifying triggers, that's a big first step. And then once we know something is a particular trigger, then you can come up with sort of a bit of a more customized or individualized plan that's going to work for you and your kid to sort of have a different set of tools that you're going to use to respond. And a lot of times, honestly, like having some sort of cognitive mantra of like, this is safe. We'll figure this out. I can handle this. Or I know we can get through this. Like, it's not going to feel this way forever. Something that helps you just kind of slow things down and reduce the speed at which your threat response can kick in.
Yeah.
Such
Yeah,
helpful
so
advice.
helpful. And so helpful, I think, to really address any kind of trigger, right? Being able to understand yourself, bring self-awareness, know your patterns, look at your history, start to heal yourself. I
Mhm.
mean, I think just this whole topic around parenting and alignment is just like a whole world into activation and healing and your own childhood history and your own triggers in your own marriage. And so there's just so much that's happening at once that I think, yeah, this idea of slowing down and really understanding, okay, what's happening in me, what's happening in these relationships, what's happened in my history is so big.
Mhm. Yeah. And to bring it back to the couple, right? It's also sometimes it's the child's behavior might be triggering, but really being watched as you try to parent is also triggering, right? If you
Yes,
believe that your partner is watching you and judging you and
yes,
thinking that you are doing it wrong, like
Mm-hmm.
you both may need to do some separate work to heal those triggers because it's going to be
yeah,
hard to parent intuitively and parent in attunement with your kid and do all that hard work of self-regulating when your kid's activating you, when you also feel like you're being like evaluated in real time. Like that's
yeah.
something that is really important to
Mm-hmm.
like kind of talk through and figure out a way to how do we practice trusting each other a little bit more?
Mm-hmm.
Such a good
Mm-hmm.
point. Such a good
Absolutely.
point.
Hi, LoveLink listeners. Our group practice, Modern Mind, is located in New York City with offices in Brooklyn and Manhattan, offering in-person and virtual psychotherapy. We provide individual, couples, and group therapy, as well as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in conjunction with a psychiatry prescriber. Therapy is a powerful experience that can transform your life and help you live it to its full potential. We're here to help take you where you want to go. To find out more about our practice, visit www.modernmind.co or email info@modernmind.co to be connected with one of our therapists.
I'm curious what your approach is when, in the moment, one parent sees their spouse acting in a way that they really don't agree with,
Mm-hmm.
and whether they intervene in the moment or whether it's important to be on the same page in front of the kid and kind of bring this up later on. I feel like this is sort of an ancient question of,
Yeah.
do we kind of deal with this behind closed doors, or do we intervene in front of our child and either protect the child or have some kind of conflict that you're resolving in real time?
Yeah. I'll caveat my answer with if there's a safety concern, like let's say one parent is just too far gone and like they're seeing so much red that they're just like gonna do something or say something that's just not obviously if it's like an immediate safety concern, you just intervene. But if even if it's just like a emotional safety like, oh man, you are in so deep right now that like you're gonna do something that's I want to protect you from damaging this relationship with our kid in this moment. I'm gonna step in. So like I do think it is okay to say, you know what? I'm just going to take over. Everybody needs to take a breath. We all need a break. I'm calling a timeout. We'll figure this out in a minute, but I'm just stepping in and I'm going to cool the scene. And that might
Yeah.
be really activating for the mad parent, but you just kind of have to shield and kind of get in between, and be like, I'm just doing this. You and I can figure this out later, but I'm stepping in. It's probably going to be more effective in the long run to avoid undermining one another in front of the kid, because as much as your approach might objectively be more effective, the layer of confusion and conflict that then gets kind of layered on can compound things for the kid. And so that's not to say you're not allowed to have conflict in front of your kids, because that's not realistic. And we're human beings and we argue and we fight and we struggle with agreeing with things in the moment, and we make up and we model repair. And, you know, there's definitely times where like me and my husband have had an argument in front of our kids, and afterwards my kids will come up to me and be like, that what happened? Why were you saying that? Like, is everything okay? And they're 5 and 7, so they're like little. And I'll have to say like, oh, you know what? We lost our cool. That happens sometimes even for grown-ups. And you know what? We afterwards we talked about it and we made up, because that's what happens, right? People fight. And then the most important thing is that we figure it out. We come back together. We make up, and we feel like we can repair what felt undone by the fight. That's perfectly fine. But I do think if we're constantly fighting with each other about how to parent the child in the moment in front of the child, then the child can sometimes take on this sort of inferred sense of responsibility that like they're the cause of the parental conflict. And it can be really confusing. They can really internalize that, and it can result in either internalizing behaviors, like maybe they're holding a lot of guilt or fear or shame, and they start to like kind of feel bad about their own role in things. Or, and I think with younger kids, it's more common that it turns out in externalizing behaviors. And you just see a kid who doubles down on a lot of the behaviors that are causing the fights. So it can actually it can seem like the kid's just behaving more problematically, but really it's the conflict is creating more dysregulation in the child. And so we can actually be inadvertently making the situation a whole lot worse by fighting about it in front of our kid. So that's why I think those conversations should be had, and the discrepancies should be addressed. But I think it's more important that it's done privately and in your own private relationship work, not in the moment with the kid, because that's more what we're trying to protect from than like, oh, you know what? We derailed a plan that would have been a more effective parenting intervention. There's going to be a trillion opportunities for effective parenting interventions. And so that will present itself again and again and again. You don't need to worry. It will happen. There'll be plenty more opportunities to teach a lesson, model something, guide a kid.
Right. So really talking to your partner afterwards, really getting on the same page or sharing, some of your concerns and doing that sort of on your own time. And then, the opportunities will, I'm sure, come up again to practice something differently or do it in a way that you both have agreed upon. Yeah.
So this is shifting gears a little bit, but I'm curious to hear about co-parents who are divorced, where it's two separate families and one child, where a united front might not be possible. I mean, in a best case scenario, it is, and those two parents talk and communicate, but a lot of the time, unfortunately, they don't. And so I wonder what you see in those families, both what are the issues and also what is a child's capacity to function in two very different households?
It really depends also, because divorce usually has a lot of other confounding variables, right? Like when families are choosing to separate and divorce, it's very rarely just because of like parenting stuff, right? I think from a parenting standpoint, ideally, we're parenting with consistency, because especially when a child is going through a divorce, there's so much changing and there's so much they have to learn to adapt to. And there's so many questions that they hopefully aren't having to fill in a lot of the blanks on. But like whenever possible, we want to stabilize and reduce as many variables as we possibly can that are going to change for this kid, right? And so predictability, consistency, having a sense that like, I know what's expected of me and it's consistent across both environments is optimal, especially for younger kids. Does that mean that two parents must parent identically for this kid to be able to get through this divorce and thrive? No. In the families that I have worked with, where even in the relationship before the divorce, there was conflict over parenting approaches, that the most successful families post-divorce all had this in common, which is that they understood and they accepted that they approached things very differently, and that was irreconcilable why they separated. And there was a very concerted effort, nonetheless, to almost like double down on getting in alignment. In my practice, we do a lot of like co-parenting, parenting coaching. Like you're getting divorced. Now is the time to fix the parenting strategies so that you sort of create a lower risk for the kid going forward, right? Most people who go through divorces as parents are pretty invested in reducing the impact of that divorce on their child, right? Very rarely is that not top of mind for most parents going through divorce. And so sometimes that is like the motivating factor that actually gets them to say, like, I couldn't rally for this during the marriage, but my desire to protect my kid from the fallout of this divorce and increase their capacity for resilience in the face of this divorce is actually now far more motivating to me to just dial in these parent coaching skills, like dial it in. I think that parents who approach co-parenting through divorce with a lot of intentionality and a lot of willingness to get support around this have the best outcomes, because it's usually, if we don't do that, usually some of the problems that like kind of were present before the divorce get amplified post-divorce.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it can be really polarizing for a kid if, one parent is sort of disparaging of the other parent's parenting styles in front of the child or to the child. That can cause a lot of conflict for the kid. And again, when we see kids holding this, something that's just too big for them to hold, sometimes it looks like it goes inward and they hold all this negative feelings, which we don't want. But that's usually something that is less obvious. And then you see sometimes this sort of like what is a red herring, I think, is the externalizing, where a kid will become super behaviorally kind of out of control. And it's not immediately obvious all the time that it's because they're holding this sort of weight and conflict around the different parenting approaches. But I think that gets flagged more, right? Like more people are like, oh, my kids just, their behavior has gotten totally out of control. So in a way, like the kids who externalize and lose lose it all the time are actually more likely to get help, because the problem becomes flagged, right? And hopefully the help that they receive helps them kind of like connect the dots and start to say, oh, this really isn't about behavior issues. This is actually about some stressors in the family system. And we can work on this. Unfortunately, the kids who internalize sometimes they fall through the cracks because they don't look obviously dysregulated, or there isn't these very like, I can put my finger on these problems that I'm identifying. You might just see a kid start to withdraw a little bit or become highly perfectionistic because they're dealing with so much stuff on the inside that they're trying to like make things far more predictable and controlled on the outside, because they're managing other people, like grown-ups, feelings and behaviors.
Right. So when you do parent coaching for divorced parents, do you typically work with them together, or are you working with them separately?
Ideally, it's together, although sometimes that's really challenging for lots of obvious reasons. And so I've definitely worked with parents individually. And usually it's because one parent is just not interested or willing to come to those sessions. And a lot of times that work is on helping the parent kind of grieve that and accept that, and then look at what they have control over. And it's usually their relationship with their kid, and what they don't have control over, which is their partner's or their ex-partner's relationship with their kid, and being able to have really solid boundaries around where I process those feelings, and it's not with my kid. It's with
Yeah.
my partner, or it's with my own therapist, or it's with a friend, but I'm going to deal with all the stuff that gets kicked up in my own adult places. And then just being able to say, like, I am going to just do what I can do to be a secure base for this kid, to have a secure relationship, because we do know, like, the research definitely supports this, that even as little as one secure attachment is predictive of a lot of protective variables, like a lot of good outcomes. So while obviously we want a child to be able to have a securely attached relationship with both parents, even if it's not possible with one of the parents, if you can create a stable and secure relationship with your child, you will still be able to offer a lot of benefit to them that might help them sort of be resilient in the face of a parent who isn't able to sort of meet their needs or create that sense of safety.
Yeah. That's super helpful to keep in mind for people.
And so important that alignment isn't always possible, especially in divorced parents.
Yeah.
And that's part of the work, right, is what you said, accepting that and grieving on their own terms and not projecting it onto their kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 And I think it's really helpful to think about this golden opportunity in a way that exists as partners are divorcing, that in some ways there's more motivation to take a look at what's going on for the child and how to get on the same page in that initial time, maybe.
Yeah.
That actually can be an opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. And even if
Yeah.
you're not getting
Right.
divorced, right? Like if you are in a relationship that, you aren't planning on leaving, but you're aware that your partner is not able to develop a secure relationship with your child for whatever reason, and you're going to stay in that relationship for whatever reason, to just know, like, I work with a lot of people who they see what's happening, and they know that what's happening between their child and their partner is not conducive to creating that sort of stable, secure sense of, secure attachment or sense of safety. And they're scared that, like, there's going to be lasting damage. And while it's not, I mean, I don't want to dismiss the reality of, like, that's not great for a kid. Like, you are right. If you are feeling that way, it makes sense that that's really scary for you. And getting stuck in that fear is not going to help. You're going to pour gasoline on everybody's fire, right? It's much more important to look at what you can control. And that is just shoring up the relationship your child has with you, and ideally working on getting in alignment with your partner as, like, a primary goal of couples therapy or family therapy. But, like, whether you're divorced or separated or with a partner who you love and want to stay married to, you still might be contending with, like, irreconcilable differences in your parenting styles, and knowing that even in extreme situations, they're not going to be able to have a healthy and safe relationship with their kid. And you need to be able to offset that by shoring up your own relationship with them. And when they get older, helping them process that, but not, it's tricky. If that's a situation you're in, I mean, please know you don't have to do this all by yourself. Like, this is very much a place to get help around. Like, there is a lot of resources for families that are navigating that kind of discord, right? You don't have to figure it out by yourself. You don't have to do this alone.
But I think it's a really important message just to lower the anxiety, because especially with parents who are divorced, like, I'm thinking about cases I've seen where a person is really frustrated by the parenting of their former spouse and feels so helpless and so agitated, like, just to know it only takes one secure attachment, that how grounding that is, because there's a lot of real estate inside that can be focused on the other parent when really there's nothing they can do. It's not like they have any control over that situation.
Yeah. No, I think that reducing your anxiety around it by focusing on what you can control also gives you so much more bandwidth as a parent to just really, I want to, like, double down on on the relationship you have with your kid, right? Because that's ultimately going to be so much more impactful than trying to change another person's parenting style.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this
has
is
been
so
so
helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
I know, we are saying it out, just timed it exactly the same. Sarah, where can people find you? What are you working on these days?
Yeah, I have a securely attached podcast. So that's a great place to kind of hear more of this stuff. And I have a group practice in Westchester, New York that serves families kind of across the state of New York. And we have some people who are licensed in a couple other states now, where we really work with families, across the family timeline. So parenting challenges, but also we see kids, we see adults. So you can learn more about my practice at upshurebren.com. And then you can learn more about my work with parents and my podcast at drsarahbren.com, or you can go look up the Securely Attached podcast anywhere that you download podcasts.
It's such a good podcast and so helpful, and you cover so many different topics. So I absolutely recommend our audience check you out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I love that podcast so much because I get to talk to such amazing, amazing people. I've learned so much in the years of doing it.
Totally. We feel similarly, and it's an honor to have you on here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This is great.
Anytime.